friends, and welcome to All by My Show. I'm Miss Rachel, and it's so nice to see you. Today's panel is Magic and Monsters, Classic Inspirations, Modern Stories. Five incredible YA authors are here today to talk to you about their new stories that feature whether it's classic literature, mythology, legends, or even just supernatural beings that have long histories. Those authors are Paige Lavoie, Rin Chupeco, Brigid Kemmerer Emily Roberson. Your monthly treat is a description of the movie that will use your page telling you all of the books you can afford to fill your black hole as you please. Or you can fill out the form that's there telling you which books you'd like hard copy when the library is empty again. I hope you enjoy this panel.
Like, what are we doing here?
Hey friends, me again. Just so you know, we had a little internet connection problem while filming this panel. So if there's ever a point where you don't see an author's face, it's just because the video paused, even though the audio kept going, so I've just edited it slightly. Hi friends, welcome to our Magic and Monsters panel. I would like to start off by having all of our lovely panelists introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their books. So anybody can go first.
All right, I'll go. Hi, I'm Brigid Kemmerer. I am the author of 11 books for young adults. Probably my most recent and my most well-known is A Curse so Dark and Lonely, which is a loose Beauty and the Beast retelling where the prince is cursed to relive his 18th autumn over and over again until he can convince a girl to fall in love with him. And I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. I'm super excited to be here.
I'll go. I'm Emily Roberson. My book is Styles of Gods and Monsters. It's a retelling of the Minotaur myth with reality TV, and it's sort of keeping up with the Kardashians, crossed with the Hunger Games, with a whole bunch of mythology, and in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this is my debut.
I can go next. Hi, I'm Paige Lavoie. I am a young adult author from Orlando, Florida, and my monster book, I don't have a physical book with me, so hey, look at that book cover on a phone screen. You can't really see it, and it doesn't matter because it's getting re-released at some point in time soon with a prettier cover. But it's A Girl Called Monster. It's a modern-day Frankenstein story that was inspired by My Fair Lady, and yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Hi, my name is Caleb Roehrig. I'm the author of various and sundry thrillers for young adults, including this year is a very monster and magic-filled year for me. Currently out now is A Werewolf in Riverdale, which is sort of exactly what it sounds like if you are a fan of Archie comics. It is about werewolves in Riverdale. I am also the author of the forthcoming Fell of Dark, which is a apocalyptic vampire adventure about a sarcastic art nerd in Illinois who may or may not be the key to preventing the apocalypse.
So hi, my name's Rin Chupeco, and my book, Wicked As You Wish, was out last March 3, 2020, and it's about fairy tale retellings about monsters and teens who don't necessarily want to save the world, but want to save their friend. And so, hi.
So my first question for all of you, since this is Magic and Monsters, what I really liked about putting this panel together is that monsters appear very differently throughout all of your books. And sometimes it's an internalized thing, and sometimes it's a very, very much not. It's literally vampires and werewolves, or a Minotaur. And so I was wondering what your initial concept of monsterdom was when you were thinking about your books, if that makes sense.
I can talk to that. For me, I think the question that I had the whole time is, it's like kind of a cliched answer, but I really did feel like who are the monsters was kind of my core question, because when you read the book, I feel like in my book, there is really a tragic figure. Like, he's a monster. You would never argue that he's just been buffeted by circumstance, and yet there are so many people around in this world that are really monstrous. And so that, going into it and writing, doing a retelling, I really want to change the core relationship between the Minotaur and Neri. So I knew the monster had to shift. So
Emily, I had a similar sort of thought going into the book. I immediately knew, because it's a Frankenstein retelling, that Dr. Monty would not be the monster. It was going to be Dr. Frankenstein. Like, he's the worst. That was another reason why I was so inspired by the dynamics of My Fair Lady and kind of wove them into the manuscript, because as a kid, we watched My Fair Lady at my grandparents' house all the time. And I hated Henry Higgins. I thought he was terrible. I thought he was the villain. I did not think they should be together. I thought that ending was...
Thank you.
Yeah, right? It's just... He's... And I would like go in like... It was like that first ranting about a film, just like child me being like, I don't think this is right. And that just continued into adulthood. And I really wanted it to be this girl that he made in a laboratory that is different. He literally stitched her together. He's calling her a monster. And by the end of the book, she's like, no, that's you. I don't think so. Like, I'm fine. Which isn't a major spoiler. That's where you want to be with that arc. But yeah, so it was that kind of like, who is the real monster trope that I had a lot of fun playing with.
For me, since both of the books that I'm talking about, one is werewolves and one is vampires, they're both monsters that were originally human. Like, they're both transformed humanoid monsters. Werewolves are human for most of the year, most of the month. Vampires are not. But I really liked playing with the idea of, I don't know, the morality, the question of, particularly for the werewolves. Sure, there are these like horrible, mindless killing beasts 3 nights out of the month, but for the rest of the time they're human. And how do they feel about that? And what is our moral obligation toward, with regard to that? And if you have to hunt a werewolf, this is somebody who might even be unaware that they're a monster. So I don't know, I kind of had fun playing with those moral questions. A huge influence on me as a storyteller is Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I tried to bring a lot of that sort of that feeling to the Fell of Dark. I wanted the vampires to be complex. I didn't want them to necessarily be like misunderstood, but I also didn't want to just have them be like mindless killing monsters. So there's a lot more complexity there. They have their own kind of social structure. They've got their own sort of, they have their own kind of morality, but I don't know, I just sort of liked playing with the idea of what it means to be human and what it means to be to feel othered, I guess.
I would say, so in mine, obviously with a Beauty and the Beast retelling, you definitely have the monster in the beast. But when I was writing A Curse so Dark and Lonely, I really kind of wanted to play with the ideas of what was kind of canon in the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale. And one of the things that always really bugged me was that, yes, we have this poor, pathetic beggar woman who comes to the castle and the prince turns her away. And, then suddenly he's cursed to be a beast until he can solve this, massive problem. And I've always been like, yeah, he was kind of a jerk, but that's a really big punishment. He slammed the door in her face, but really, does he need to suffer forever? So I really wanted to play with the idea of, was he really the beast? Was he truly the monster? Was she more of a monster? And in my book, she definitely is a bit of a monster. I think there's a lot to be said and played with, especially in retelling fairy tales, with looking at who somebody is inside versus who somebody is, what they show to the outside world. And I think, somebody doesn't have to look like a monster to really be a monster.
Well, for me, monsters are like really important in Asian like culture, basically, because I live and grew up in Asia, and monsters pretty much dominate almost everything we have here. Like, we have monsters specifically for toilets. We have monsters like waiting on roofs, preying specifically on pregnant women. Like, for every fear that we have, there's like an accompanying monster to blame. And as I grew up, and Western culture, Western traditions sort of came in and started like clashing with some of the Asian cultures and Asian traditions, I slowly started realizing that what people say are monsters, because what they use in a lot of cases to call people who they consider an other. And as somebody who considers herself something of an other, I found that I've more sympathy for a lot of those monsters most of the time. Like it all came back to, I have a book called The Girl from the Well. It was my debut book, and it was the retelling of The Ring, basically. But it was also based on Japanese mythology, which The Ring was based on my writing for all of my books, and which is why my newest one is about like fairy tale retellings and how people perceive fairy tales and all the monsters and all the creatures they're in with a modern setting. And I think it's really great that, I love monsters. What can I say? I think there's a more sympathetic turn toward monsters in more recent years, because they understand that sometimes what you're afraid of is just something you don't understand.
Brigid. When I was thinking about this panel, I was thinking about what book I first discovered like you all on like from reading, and for you it was your contemporaries. Like, that's where I first like found your books, and what I was really interested in is the fact that your contemporaries and your fantasies are like they're very different, very, very different, but you do dual point of view so well, like so well. Like, it just destroys me. And so what I was wondering is, like, did you ever consider writing any of these in not dual point of view? Did it sort of just happen? Did it work for the story? Or like, what are some of your favorite things about writing where the characters all have perspective?
So it's funny, when I first started writing, all of my books were single point of view, like before I ever got published. And I started writing the first book that would ultimately become my debut novel. And I had written, I don't know, like 40,000 words from the point of view of the girl. And I had this teen boy, and I was like, I really want to add his half of the story. And I kept like dogging my husband around the house, being like, so what's it feel like when a guy falls in love? What does it feel like when a girl's attractive? What do you think about when somebody is angry? Oh, look, sneaking in here. Oh, it's my son. Maybe mommy's on a call. You can't.
It's okay.
This is the story of my life.
We understand.
And you can feel free to leave that in. I know, and so like I said, it's so hard for them right now. Though I don't know where my husband is for that to happen. Anyway, so I was driving my husband crazy, asking him all these questions, like, how do you guys do this? How do they feel? How do they think? And finally he was like, hon, I'm just trying to watch the game. And I'm like, no, I need your help. And he said something that I think about a lot. And he was like, stop trying to write every guy into this character. You don't write your female characters that way. Just write them the way you want to write them. And it sounds so simple, but it was really incredibly freeing for me. And once I did that, you know, I just kind of fell right into it, and I loved writing in dual point of view. And even with Curse, I'd written like, I don't know, half the book in third person past tense, still in the dual point of view, but a little looser. And I kept thinking this would be better if it was in first person present tense, like all my contemporaries. And it felt like too much work to go back and change it. So I kept writing until I got to 85,000 words, and then decided, no, I really need to go back and start from the beginning. And that was awful. But I'm glad I did it. Because it's my favorite way to write.
Amazing. Okay,
Thanks.
Rin, since your picture image seems to be kind of clear right now, we'll go to you, internet. One of the things that I love across all of your books, because not only do you have Wicked, which just came out, but we've got the Never Tilting World, and we've got the Bone Witch trilogy, and Girl from the Well, like you told us about. Your world building is so dynamic and inventive. Like I would read like a whole shelf full of history books just about the worlds that your characters live in. So what is that sort of you're welcome. What is that like world building process like for you? Like, do you have it all planned out before you've started? Obviously not all. Do you have most of it planned out? Like, you know what the world looks like, you know the history before you start, or does that evolve as you are writing?
Well, the weirdest thing is that I actually do not. Like, when I first start writing, I have very much a bare bones idea of what the world is going to be, but I have no sense of like details of culture, of like, I know that especially in the Bone Witch, there's like a lot of attention to detail, and there's a reason why there's a lot of attention to detail, because it sort of prepares you for what's to come in the following books. But when I first started writing it, it's not those details that's the first thing that comes to mind. It's what I want those, it's a little hard to put into words, but it's basically when I first conceive of a story, the first thing that comes to mind is the people. And it's basically my main character, and it's why is she the main character? Like that's always the first thing that pops into my head. Like, why am I making her the main character, and why not all these have, you know, they have interesting stories of their own, and I don't really, why would you like pick this specific character to be your protagonist or whatever? And I think that the biggest reason why I choose my protagonist, like with Thea, who is the protagonist in The Bone Witch, I figured what character that I've come up with my head so far is the one that's most likely to lose everything when I put her as the main character. So, you know, which character can I place in that position that has the biggest stakes? Which character has the most to lose? And from there, I start building. Well, this character loses this certain thing. Like for Thea, it's her sense of agency. Like, because in The Bone Witch, it's basically people want to take advantage of her because they value her abilities, which is to be able to put down monsters, which no other person is able to do. But in the process, she loses her life over it, and they're perfectly willing to take advantage of that, and that's something she refuses to roll over for. So after that, the next question comes: what kind of world would exist that would allow this certain situation to happen? And that's where I start, you know, building the bare bones of the world. And from there, most of the details that come to mind is when I actually start writing chapters. There's really nothing about the world that I have planned beforehand.
Emily.
Yes,
You have the Minotaur.
I do.
But you also have this just genius idea of like making it the reality show. And it is one of those things where I heard it pitched the first time and I was like, somebody did that. Somebody thought of that. And you're the one who thought of that. Like, it's so genius and it works so well. And I'm wondering, what did you think of it? Like, when you thought of this idea at first, you were like Minotaur, but reality show. Like, did you?
It's actually swapped. So
Oh,
here's
you had reality show, but Minotaur.
so I was thinking about the Kardashians, as one does, and you know how people say they're not famous for anything, like they don't do anything. People will say that all the time. The Kardashians, they don't do anything. First of all, I would completely argue against that, because if they're not doing, they're not doing nothing, because billions of dollars later. But I was trying to think about what's comparable to them. Like, they're not royalty, they're just like random rich girls from California. Like, what is like that? And then I thought the people in mythology, not the heroes, but the random people who just get swept up into the world of the gods. And so then I started thinking about all those stories that we have, like whether it's the Minotaur, the origin of the Minotaur, or Leda and the Swan, or Europa getting carried into the ocean by the bull. And you thought, who told? Like, who? Like, Europa gets carried off by a bull and her friends like immediately call up the paparazzi and are like, you're not gonna believe what happened. And so I had this image specifically of the genesis of the Minotaur. I feel like is maybe the grossest, like weirdest, worst story from mythology. It's got a wooden cow. It's awful. And I kept thinking, like, who would ever tell that this happened? And then I thought, well, what if you were really famous like that? There would be paparazzi in the trees taking pictures. So that first scene, that's the first chapter of the book, I wrote as a piece of flash fiction. Just like, the way you sit down and you're like, oh, not really working on anything, have kind of funny idea, and so I wrote this. And then I backed into that it had to be Ariadne, and everything else built on top of that. But I really didn't start with like, oh, this would be a cool idea to mesh these two things together. It's that I think they're related, and then the whole thing built on top. But it was a lot more organic than I think. The pitch makes it seem like it was like engineered, but it was really, the whole thing was very organic.
Genius. I love it. It's so good. But so since we're already back in mythology, we're gonna fast forward a little bit to Frankenstein. Miss Paige, hey. So you, in addition to being an author, you are like the vintage queen. Like I've stayed in hotels with you, so I know like pearls, like you've got everything. You've got the fashion. And I was wondering how your sort of love of this like vintage aesthetic plays into your writing.
It seeps in when I don't realize it. Like, kind of like most things, like I feel like a lot of emotions I'm processing will end up in my stories, just like a lot of the clothing I wear. So particularly with A Girl Called Monster, there's little things like in the doctor's study, it's all very vintage with like a record player and like an old-fashioned couch. And I really like put, honestly, the aesthetic of the living room of the place that we lived in before we moved into our 1950s house, which was very like kind of dark and Victorian. And I put that into the book. And the clothing that she ends up getting later on when she finally gets to go shopping is also based on a dress I had. I was thinking about this character. I'm like, okay, she would want something whimsical. She would want something fun and colorful. And then I looked at my closet and I saw this little dress with foxes on it. And I went, she would want that dress. That great. Yeah, so it all ends up kind of accidentally weaving in, whether I mean for it to happen or not. Same with the music in A Girl Called Monster. That was kind of weird though, where Putting on the Ritz haunted me, which is funny because it's from Young Frankenstein, but literally any radio station I had on, it was like the clip from Jeepers Creepers, where Jeepers Creepers just keeps coming on in the radio, and it's different songs from different eras. That with Putting on the Ritz, like it was like a techno version would come on, the old version would come on, 5 different covers from the 1920s, and I was like, I guess I'm gonna write it into the book. I guess that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, last but not least, Caleb. I know you've been waiting for it. So up until this point, up until this year, your books have I wouldn't say traditional because they're like mind-blowing and unique, but you've been sort of more traditional, like thriller, mystery thriller, and not so much supernatural. And this year we've got 2 supernatural. And so I'm wondering if that pivot was always something that you had wanted to do, if it was always something that was planned, or if it just sort of came about very organically.
Let's see, how do I describe this? So like 10 years ago, I tried to write a vampire story because vampires were I don't know if you know this or not, but vampires were very popular in YA at one point. And I had read at that time, I had read an interview with, I think it was an agent, but she said something along the lines of, if you want to be published now, your book needs to have shapeshifters, vampires, werewolves. And I took that as a prescriptive comment rather than a complaint. And so I was like, oh, okay, well then I got to write one of these things. And so I wrote about vampires. I was really into like the vampire, but I'd been into Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I was really into Vampire Diaries and True Blood. And at the time, I did not realize that as soon as you can identify a trend, it's too late to jump onto it. So I wrote a whole manuscript and it wasn't good. And I didn't try to sell it because by the time I finished it, I realized I had missed the boat. But it was something that it was always sort of in my back pocket because I had created this universe that I really liked. And I always sort of had this idea in mind that one day maybe I would go back to it and revisit it. So I just sort of like trunked the idea. I had planned a series of 5 novels. I had written the first one. I'd thumbnailed 4 more. And as ideas sometimes tend to do, when I tucked it away and stopped thinking about it, it became better in my mind. It's like wine. It's like you lay up your vintage and it gets better over time. So like in my mind, my crappy story got better and better. And I was like, wow, that was really good. And it really deserves another chance. And then I would say, like fast forward to maybe, I think it was last year, maybe the year before that, but Sandra Mitchell approached me about contributing a short story to an anthology called Out Now, Queer We Go Again, which comes out in May. And I had to write a short story, and I really struggled to come up with a plot for it. And I finally realized that what I really wanted to tell was a story about 2 boys who are frenemies who are forced to hide together during a vampire invasion of their homecoming dance. And I finally said, I was like, this is the story I need to write. So I wrote it and I loved it. I lived for that story. I had such a great time. And when I finished it, I thought, I don't want to leave this universe. Like, I love this world. I created this world where people know about vampires and they find them very annoying because they're this huge nuisance. They kill people sometimes, you have to have all these like municipal structures in place to sort of deal with them. And I just sort of loved living in that universe. And so I wrote to my editor. Oh, and it was right at that time that Renee Adia's The Beautiful was announced. And then Zoraida Cordova, her anthology was Vampires Never Get Old. Is that it?
Her and Natalie C. Parker, yep.
Yeah, yes. And I was like, this might be my chance. Like, this might be my one chance to write my vampire story. So I wrote to my editor and I said, I had just finished outlining a whole other story, and I said, but I want to write vampires. And she said, okay, go for it. So I did. And I went back and I dusted off that old manuscript, and I was like, half my work's already done. And then I opened it, and it's like when you take that bottle that you have been laying up for 10 years and you open it and it's vinegar. That's what it was. So I had to start
all over again, completely from scratch. Just I stripped everything down. I kept one plot twist, the one plot twist that that I had remembered correctly. I kept that one thing, and then the rest of it is completely original. But with that one, yeah, so it sort of was both a mix of organic and then also just opportunity knocked and I answered. As for A Werewolf in Riverdale, that one was pure opportunity. That was, I grew up with Archie comics and I love the Archie universe, and I wanted so badly to write for them that I had when I found that they had sold their license to Scholastic, I asked my agent to pitch me to them. And yada, 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 TLDR, they replied offering me the chance to write for a novel for the Archie horror comic series, Jughead the Hunger, and I jumped at it, so.
Awesome. So in all of your books, there's some form of retelling, whether it's like very, very overt, or just a retelling of, you know, legends and myths that have been around. I mean, vampires are all technically, like, there must have been a first vampire story at one point, you know, and several iterations of things like Frankenstein and vampires and Beauty and the Beast and, you know, the Minotaur and all of these sorts of things have come down through the pipeline. And I'm wondering, in terms of writing something that has an influence in earlier storytelling, do you revisit those things while you're working on them, on your stories, or do you go from your memory of your experience with them, since it doesn't have to be an exact thing? Like, how much of the original do you let seep in to the new?
I mean, with Beauty and the Beast, I really thought about, well, first of all, I've always loved Beauty and the Beast. It has always been my favorite fairy tale. And I know that's such a common thing for people to say, but I love the idea of really being able to fall in love with somebody for who they are, not necessarily the exterior they present to the outside world. And when I was a kid growing up, I was obsessed with the Disney version. I remember I would like stalk the Disney Channel waiting to see the preview of the movie. I realize I'm showing my age a bit here. And there was this family that I used to babysit for, and they had this old black and white French subtitled version. And I would just like send the kids to bed as early as possible so that I could watch that movie. Like, I was eager to babysit for them just so I could watch that stupid black and white movie. But when I was writing it, I did want to stay true to the whole idea of the curse and her father being involved somehow, of her getting into trouble and getting trapped. But the one thing I was really sensitive to, that I think with Beauty and the Beast always comes out, is the whole Stockholm syndrome thing. So I wanted to make sure when I was, you know, having Harper fall in love with Prince Ren, that the Stockholm syndrome was addressed, that, you know, she was able to escape, that she wasn't truly trapped there in the beginning, and that she truly made a choice for herself, not because she was held captive. And one thing that I learned as I was, you know, going along through the whole Beauty and the Beast thing, because in my head, so when I was growing up, I was always, you know, kind of this chubby, bookish, nerdy kid who was always a little bit of the outcast. And I think that's part of what made Beauty and the Beast so appealing, was that somebody could fall in love with you for like who you are inside. And then someone told me, they were like, no, that's not really what Beauty and the Beast is about originally. It was a story to comfort girls in arranged marriages. And I was like, oh, well, that's not a fun explanation. So I'm just going to keep my version that I like the most.
I'll go. So I really wanted to keep the signposts of the myth. The cool thing about the Minotaur myth is it hasn't been retold as much as some stories have. So what I did was I went basically to the Wikipedia entry and was just like, I just want to hit the main parts of it. But the most important thing for me was, because I wasn't telling Theseus's story, I was telling Ariadne's story. And in all versions of the Minotaur myth that you look at in a picture book, Ariadne falls instantly in love with Theseus, And everything she does is because of that. And that, I knew that that wasn't true. Like, especially once I identified that the Minotaur was her half brother. I was like, that just isn't the way this story is going to be told. So what I wanted to do was actually have you, the whole time you're reading the book, be like, I hope she changes the end. I hope she changes the end, because it ends up, what has to happen is really wrenching. And so, but then I did totally change the end of the myth because I didn't like it. So that's how I mean, like, I held to some stuff because I really wanted to, and then other stuff I just changed.
For me, what was helpful is that both vampires and werewolves, there's just an endless amount of tellings of those stories, like the legends and the across cultures, across time periods, and I really kind of got to just go through and put my hands on whatever I wanted. You know, like at this point, there are so many different versions of those, and even in just contemporary retellings, they all sort of borrow this from the past and then create their own little twist on it. And so I did a lot of that myself. I just sort of picked the things that I liked the most. I picked some of the things that I thought would lend themselves to creating some, like, I didn't want to make it too, my vampires don't walk in the sun. They are vulnerable to sunlight. And I did that in part because I sort of felt like, I understand why for a lot of, especially television shows, they have to have an excuse to get them out in the daylight, because it frees up your shooting schedule like so much, and it allows you to create so many more kinds of opportunities for drama between the characters, especially like humans and vampires. I didn't need that, and I sort of felt like I wanted to go back to doing that. But I also, my vampires are capable of mesmerism, which was really tricky, because how do you have vampires that can entrance their victims without that becoming like a crutch that they constantly fall back on and robbing people of free will, and then you get into like hinky territory with that. So I don't know, it allowed me to do a lot of exploring and sort of coming up with my own twists on these myths. And I don't know, I find that I find that in some regard, having those, like, these kinds of parameters in a way is very freeing, because then I don't have to do all of that world building myself. Some of that stuff already exists, and I can kind of pick and choose which ones I want, and then I build my fence, and then my garden is within that fence. So for me, it was I had the benefit of having a lot of different versions of vampire mythology, but no vampire story. Like, I wasn't retelling the vampire story. I just got to borrow from all the vampire stories.
Well, for me, I really love subversions. So growing up, I had all these like mythologies and all these fairy tales. Like, we have Filipino fairy tales, I have Chinese fairy tales, we had like Western fairy tales, like the classic ones like Red Riding Hood and Little Mermaid, Cinderella, and so forth. And I was sort of a weird kid, and since I was reading all these fairy tales almost at once and learned of them almost at once, it got into my head somehow that, hey, maybe all these fairy tales have a shared universe. So as a kid, I was already thinking like it's like a Marvel universe. Every fairy tale has a shared universe that everybody interacts with and connects with. And that idea sort of continued until, I finally found the place for it, which was in Wicked As You Wish. And Wicked As You Wish was, as I said before, a fairy tale retelling, but set in modern times. And it was basically, what if fairy tales were an actual part of history? Like, what if fairy tales were real and they were incorporated into modern history as we know it? So there were a lot of subversions and a lot of twists that I've had to do, so that for every fairy tale reference that I make in those books, every like creature, every monster that comes into the plot, I tried to twist it so that it somehow comes off as being very different and unique. Like, for instance, there are two characters who are descended from Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham. And you would imagine that one of the main characters would be the descendant of the sheriff of Robin of Locksley. But I chose to instead incorporate the son, the son of the family, the major family who was descended from the sheriff of Nottingham instead, and see his point of view. And like, it's those little things that I feel helps turn fairy tales into something that is newer and something that's said in a way that more people would look at it from a different viewpoint as well. Like, I specifically wrote about Maria Makiling, and Maria Makiling is, in Filipino mythology and Filipino fairy tales, she was like the enchantress. She was like the goddess of a major forest mountain here in the Philippines. And she is known for like helping people, helping nearby villages when they're, when they don't have food or when they're lost or on their way home. And I chose to sort of incorporate her as a modern freedom fighter, for which my main character was descended from. So, Maria Makiling was this mythology that was conceived back during the Spanish-Filipino War, and also, the Filipino-American War, where we were fighting for our freedom. And Maria Makiling came to be known by a lot of people because her story took place during that time frame as a sort of symbol for freedom as well. And that's something that I also wanted to reimagine and sub my story to make it more consistent with my heritage and what I grew up with.
I think my answer is pretty similar to everybody else, where it's thinking about these classic stories, what you want to kind of cherry pick, like I think most of you said, and put into this new modern story. And like Rin just said, I was thinking about my book and I'm like, okay, I want to do Frankenstein. I want it to be modern times. And then you start asking yourself those what if questions. So I'm like, okay, what if the doctor's laboratory is in a suburban basement and you don't find out until she escapes? That's weird. Well, I'm just gonna like note that down. What if when she does finally escape from this laboratory and she is going into the nearest town, a friendly, punky hairstylist waves her across the street. And that's where she finds this new family. So it's not Dr. Frankenstein who's really showing her what it is to be alive. It's all of these new friends in this family that she is surrounding herself with and really take her in. And within the story, there's a lot of twists that come along with that. But I didn't end up going back to the source material and reading, which was funny because a little after the book came out, my aunt asked me, she was like, oh, well, we're reading Frankenstein with my book club. I'm sure you have feelings on it. Like, what did you think of the original story? And I was like, I haven't read it since high school. And she was really shocked that I wasn't reading it while I was writing the book. But it was, I don't know, I guess it was important to me to make sure there was distinctions and make sure there was like a difference in tone. Like I said earlier, I took a lot of inspiration from My Fair Lady, but also Steel Magnolias, which is like a good comp titles for a YA book. No, but it all really does blend together nicely to make something that I feel like turned out to be really fun and unique.
So I think this is going to be my last question based on where we're at with time. So are there any magical stories that you think people should check out right now while we're all stuck inside, whether they're movies or shows or books, any sort of media that is magical that you think people should check out?
Lore Olympus. Oh my gosh, it's so good. If you're even if you're not into webtoons, like it's a Hades and Persephone retelling.
What's it called? Say it again.
Lore Olympus.
I love Lore.
Oh, I love it too. It's so good. And I'm writing a very loose Hades and Persephone inspired story right now. That's the rough draft I've just finished and I've been like doing edits on, which is like, when I say it's like inspired, it's like like the only elements it has is representing like a life and a death, where I was like, okay, I want him to be the son of a funeral director and I want her mom to be a midwife, and we can kind of have two ends of the spectrum. But me aside, it's so good. It's just like such a compelling story. Trigger warning, there is some really heavy stuff in there, but the artist and also the webtoon app is really good about flashing those warnings and making sure you're aware when sensitive content is coming up. But 10 out of 10.
I've got one, actually have it right here. It's kind of magic and it's kind of nuts.
Oh, we love it.
Have you guys read The 10th Girl?
Sarah, my darling.
I have it, but I haven't read it yet. It's on my.
It is like
Yeah.
ghosts and a haunted Patagonian boarding school. And I read it last summer on vacation. And this is before I actually did a launch event with Sarah, but I hadn't met her or anything. I just read it. I reread the whole thing. Like I finished. We're on vacation. It's like midnight. I was like, oh my gosh, what just happened? And I went back and reread the whole thing. I went to bed at like 3 o'clock in the morning, because it's one of those books that when you get to the end, you're like, oh, everything, it's like the things were separated and then they aligned, and then you're like, which I feel like is like the thing about magic in books. So anyway, it's really excellent. It's so good.
And the cover just got revealed for her second book today.
Yes, today.
What box?
But it also, it has this really, the cover is actually also really good too. It's got like a, anyway.
Yeah.
It's really good.
I'm gonna recommend a couple of things. First of all, I had to pull up my Goodreads because my brain goes like as soon as you ask for specific recommendations, it's like blank slate, tabula rasa. So obviously Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But then I highly recommend, if you like graphic novels or manga, I totally recommend Blue Exorcist. It's phenomenal. It is this absolutely phenomenal series. It's about the son of Satan who is studying to become an exorcist so he can defeat his father. Oh, it's so great. So much like imagine, the art is incredible. The story is fun. The characters are fun. I also highly recommend Wild Beauty by Anna Marie McLemore, because her writing is so gorgeous. Her writing is so gorgeous and so lush.
Caleb, can you go back and say that again with their instead of her?
Oh, I'm so sorry. You're right.
Okay. It's one of those things where I'm like, I'm not sure like who's seen what everything, but I'll
you're right.
Just go back and say the sentence over again.
Okay.
Thanks.
I also highly recommend Wild Beauty by Anna Marie McLemore, because their writing is so lush and so gorgeous. The story is beautiful. It's just an exquisite story about sisters and magic, and it's just absolutely lovely. So I highly recommend that.
Thanks.
Well, I haven't been able to read a lot of the recent releases as of yet, because ebooks kind of hurt my eyes, and lockdown happened here like late February. So I have been at this for like 2 months by now. And so all the books that I ordered has been slowly piling up at the post office with no end in sight, because the post office is closed and there's no way to get them. So I've been rereading mostly some of my old favorites, and one of my favorite authors of all time is Catherine Valente, and specifically Deathless, which is a retelling of Koshchei the Deathless and of Russian folk tales like The Firebird and Ivan Tsarevich and Maria Morevna. And The Firebird was really important in my book as well, so I really look to that book, Deathless, as like one of the best books about Russian stories of all time. And I really love her prose. It's like, if I could see what magic looks like, it would be a Catherine Valente prose, I think. And another thing, like, I would like to second Caleb with Blue Exorcist, because I love it too. And also, like, one of my favorite animes of all time, which I constantly rewatch, is, I think most people know it by now, but it's Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. And it is excellent plotting, excellent storytelling, excellent character development. Like if you want to learn how to write and you want to figure out, pacing and setting and how characters interact with each other the right way, regardless of whether they're like villains with a redemption arc or heroes who make mistakes, I highly recommend Full Metal Alchemist because, my favorite character in Full Metal Alchemist dies. Okay, it's semi-spoiler, I think, and how good is the series has since been, there's like four adaptations of the series by now, and the anime series itself has been redone like twice. So how amazing is this series for me to keep watching it despite constantly watching my character die a total of like 5 times by now. So, it's really good and I highly recommend it.
Oh wow, everybody had such good recommendations. So right now I'm drafting, and since when I'm drafting fantasy, I don't read a lot of fantasy because it gets in my head too much. So I've been reading a lot of adult stuff, a lot of adult romance, and especially right now during the pandemic, I've been reading a lot of silly stuff because I just really need happily ever afters. I recently read From Blood and Ash by Jen Armentrout. One of my absolute favorite fantasies is An Ember in the Ashes by Saba Tahir. I'm trying to think of something else that I've read recently. Yeah, no, everything recently has been contemporary or adult steamy stuff. So
Fair enough. Yeah, Caleb, I think you were actually the one that told me to read Blue Exorcist.
Oh, I probably was,
Yeah,
because
I feel like that.
I've been talking about it for a while. I won't shut up.
Back when I was first venturing into manga, since it's so popular at the library. Well, thank you all so much for taking time out of your days to be on this panel. It was super awesome, and I love talking about myths and monsters with y'all.
thanks, Rachel.
Thank you.
Hey y'all, thanks so much for tuning into this panel. If you're looking for more panels like it, make sure you check out the All By My Shelf playlist on our YouTube page. It'll tell you all of the different panels that you're able to watch.